Hey everyone, and welcome back to my channel. So today I'm starting a brand new series on my channel that I have been thinking about, planning, conceptualizing, storyboarding, and basically waiting for the right time to do on my channel. And I'm tentatively calling it History of Horror, or maybe I'll call it Spooky Time with Sassy Cassie. I don't know. Title pending. But this is going to be a series of videos that I am doing where I talk to you guys about the evolution of film characters in the horror genre. To do a series of videos where I would talk about horror movies or horror characters, how they came to be, how they've changed over the years, and all while doing my makeup, turning myself into one of those characters. So for our very first installment, I felt like I had to go with a real classic horror character and one that's kind of gone from horror to teen heartthrob, and that is vampires and Dracula. So when the idea of a vampire movie started, it wasn't meant to be these kind of mysterious, seductive creatures of the night. It was actually meant to be a scary, sort of borderline satanic characters that didn't even look like real people, that were just bent on killing, drinking blood, and it didn't matter who you were, they were trying to put two holes in the side of your neck. So the very first documented vampire movie was centered around a character called Nosferatu. This is a silent movie that came out in 1922, and it was actually a German film, so it wasn't even here in the States when it first came out. But it was widely known, and the character was bald, big-eared, scary, snarly teeth, and barely even looked human, or maybe like a human that had some sort of deformity or had never seen light. So he was very different. But he was basically the vampire of the 20s. And as time went on, every decade kind of got its own version of a vampire. In the 1930s, vampires were defined as the Bela Lugosi version of Dracula. This movie was produced by Universal Studios, and if you are a horror fanatic or you know anything about horror movies, Universal kind of became the authority on horror movies, which we will talk about more in the series as we go on. But they signed Bela Lugosi to play Dracula, and I believe he was Dracula in more than one film, but he was kind of the way that you think of a classic vampire. He had the big coat, but the suit underneath. He had a foreign accent because he was Hungarian. He was rich. He lived in a castle. He lived in Transylvania. So it was all those kind of things where he was more mysterious. And he was actually one of the first vampires to focus on solely female victims. So this is where we kind of start seeing the seductive, mysterious man being a vampire. So, and as time went on, vampires became more driven by sex, blood, and focused more on the victim and vampire relationship rather than the monster kind of terrorizing everyone. So it became much more solely on a victim and a vampire, or a love interest turned victim and the vampire. So all throughout the 50s, 60s, and 70s, there were some vampire movies that came out, but they were all pretty standard or really, really cheesy and bad. And the next evolution of a vampire didn't actually come until 1987 with the movie The Lost Boys. This was the first teen-centered vampire movie where all of the vampires are young, beautiful. I think the line from the movie is party all night, sleep all day, being a vampire is so fun, or is great, or something like that. I don't really know. But it made vampires glamorous. People in that movie wanted to be vampires. They wanted to be turned so they could live this like partying sort of punk life. Like some of the vampires in the movie are dressed in all black. They kind of present them in like a goth sort of punky way, which was really big in the 1980s, especially into the late 80s. So that movie also centers on new kids discovering that vampires are a thing, and one of them wants to be a vampire and one of them wants to be a vampire hunter. It took the idea of vampires being scary creatures of the night and completely threw it away, and basically was the first stepping stone for movies like Twilight. This also was the first movie that ever presented the idea that vampires were immortal. Any sort of other vampire movie was the wood stake, the cross, the holy water, the garlic, the kind of campy, kitschy things we think of when we're talking about vampires and how to get rid of them. Then there was an Interview with a Vampire with Brad Pitt and Tom Cruise, and this was another pivotal stepping stone in vampire film history because it gave us the two archetypes of the reluctant vampire who doesn't want to drink blood, doesn't want to kill, and fights his urge, and the overzealous, loves being a vampire, wants to kill, wants to drink blood, and doesn't really care who he takes out in the process kind of vampire. So this is where we get our Edward Cullen types and our, I don't remember what they're called, but the bad guys in Twilight. And if you look at the plots and the characters in Interview with a Vampire and The Lost Boys, you can kind of see where Twilight fits into that and where it slots in to some of those plots or archetypes and tropes and those sort of things. And even vampire novels that come out now. The Beautiful just came out not that long ago. It has vampires in it that kind of fit that. I don't read a lot of vampire novels, but comment yours down below that you think kind of fits into these little sections. Then into the 1990s, we got Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which kind of turned the vampire genre on its head because we weren't looking at it from a vampire's point of view. We were rooting for the vampire hunter for the first time in the genre. So Buffy was obviously a teen romance, again, another big stepping stone towards Twilight, and it was centered all around the vampires. She had romance with mortal people, she had romance with vampires, but it was also the first time in a vampire film that you really had a strong female lead who was interested in the vampires rather than a damsel in distress sort of one. And Buffy was also turned into a movie, so it basically changed the way that people wrote vampires, especially for the teen crowd. And if Lost Boys and Interview with a Vampire had not gotten so popular, Buffy probably would have never happened beyond the comics. So then we get into the 2000s, and this is the biggest, most popular time for vampires, as you can imagine. Twilight comes out and everyone loses their mind and goes crazy. This took the reluctant vampire character, threw it into a love story with a girl who was very withdrawn and had a tragic backstory, and basically created a Romeo and Juliet with a love triangle. It basically checked all the boxes for angsty teen romance with paranormal elements that you could ask for. But the biggest thing about Twilight that changed the genre of vampire, movies and TV shows is that it focused on the love story rather than vampirism. It wasn't about her wanting to be a vampire and that's why she was in love with him. She was in love with him and it happened that he was a vampire. So it really changed the way people looked at things and how we digested vampires and how we looked at them. This was one of the first times that a vampire was in the sun and didn't blow up. It was he sparkled and can't turn into a bat and they don't sleep in coffins. It basically normalized what vampires could be. Like, they could be regular people, but different, if that makes sense. You had another show that was kind of driven by love and love triangles and angst, and that was The Vampire Diaries. Again, another show where you were focused more on the love stuff, but there was a lot more vampire elements in that show. I have never watched it. I do want to watch it at some point, but as of making this, I haven't watched it. You still have the vampire hunter aspect in this show, but you really want the vampires to succeed. Like, they're your heroes, they're your protagonists, instead of being the antagonist, very much like Twilight. They lead the series, and, I think a lot of these shows just made people wish that vampires were real. And another show that came out was True Blood, which was a completely different series that more so focused on vampires being publicly acknowledged. They weren't hiding in the shadows. They were out and proud and telling people that they were vampires due to a synthetic blood being created so they could drink that instead of drinking human blood and killing people or turning people. This was basically a satirical take on a lot of different issues in America because you had the anti-vampire organizations saying they were corrupting people, that they were monsters, and that they were wrong. And then you had the vampires who were just trying to live normal, successful, everyday lives like everybody else. But the show also focused on a lot of other supernatural creatures like the Twilight series and the Vampire Diaries, like I said before. But something I found super interesting about these 3 series is that they were all based on books. Twilight was obviously a book series first. The Vampire Diaries was wildly popular before it became a TV show, and True Blood was, I believe, a graphic novel. Right now, that is where we're at with the days of vampires in movies and TV. Nosferatu is kind of taking it back to the scary, gory, creepy vampire on TV. But really, we haven't had a vampire movie in quite a while come out that stirred up a whole lot of buzz. So maybe in 2021, we will go back to vampire movies. With the Midnight Sun book coming out, we might get a new Twilight movie. Who knows? Vampires really aren't scary anymore, let's be real. There hasn't been a scary vampire movie out in a while. They are more so mysterious, beautiful, usually portrayed very young people who just happen to drink blood and bite people's necks. Is it for this installment of History of Horror or Spooky Time with Sassy Cassie? You guys tell me which you like better down below. I have lots of other ones coming up. We're going to talk about mummies, and since we talked about vampires, you know we got to talk about werewolves because I'm a werewolf fan. And I got a whole lot of other stuff that we're going to talk about, characters and everything like that. If you guys like this series, when I'm done with the initial installments, I'll do a part 2. Just let me know who you want me to talk about down below, and I hope you enjoy. Now let's move on to the mini movie. Woo-hoo.